Good evening. My name's Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again one of Macon, Georgia's leading intellectual stars, Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
We keep talking about these leading intellectual stars, and I never see them here anywhere.
I don't know.
I'd like you to introduce them to me at some point.
When I say that, maybe some money will drop from the rainbow into a tin cup, or possibly it could happen. It could happen. Well, we talk about a lot of things, and I've mentioned money a little bit. And one of the things going on now is there is a lot of inflation. There is a tremendous amount of inflation. And there are all kinds of stories about what's going on here and whether things are good or things are bad in regards to this. And I might start out by just submitting that a lot of what happened with our onset of inflation goes back to the coronavirus and the decisions that were made by the CDC and by, political operatives about what to do about that and the great dangers that the country faced. So basically everything was closed down. They closed the country down. And as a result, there was some question of a depression. So everything is dropping, no one is working, and then the government just basically started helicoptering money in to prevent that. And it could have been said that early on, a lot of the UCASI that were coming from the government, the CDC, the cost of these UCASIs to the economy weren't totally understood. And of course, one can say that they were acting out of fear and trepidation about something they'd not encountered routinely, aka a world pandemic. So in any event, the money was just been helicoptered in, and I'm going my little epistle, and then I'll turn it over to you a little bit. I'll ask you a question or two. But the CDC, the FDA was keeping an eye on the situation, and the nation's central bank basically were dropping their interest rates to a tremendously low level and basically printing money. So the money supply just rocketed up. Along with that, the national debt rocketed up. And so as things went along, people got great hunks of money given to them by the government and locked in the basement, but a huge amount of money was just passed out. So the money supply rocketed up, the national debt rocketed up, and the inflation rate stayed pretty low. And the inflation rate was in many ways kept there by the low inflation rate, by the absence of velocity of money. So the two things that really happen are you print a lot of money, everybody has money, but they don't spend it. But when they start to spend it, that's when the demand line goes up, and that's what happened. So when people could move around and drive cars and go on vacations and buy new things and eat out, all of this money went into circulation, and that's a very natural event. And that's probably the major event that occurred. And the other part of this is the supply. If you can remember Act 1, there are two lines, supply and demand, and where they cross is the price. I mean, that's it. That's the whole deal with the story. But the supply of things was in many ways hindered by the pan epidemic, and particularly the lockdowns in China, and also the war in between Russia and the Ukraine. So the supply of petroleum was diminished or altered. So there was less supply of things. So those factors really contributed to the increase in prices. And just to continue on that line of thinking, one of the things that's not appreciated is for a long time, the U.S. inflation rate has been low. And it's been low in many reasons, or many factors involved here, was exporting jobs out of the country. So there are many places, China might be one, Mexico might be one, where the people that work in the factories there work at a very low wage. They also don't have all the impediments to producing things that we have in our country. So by exporting all of these jobs and exporting factories and production, the U.S. our prices were kept down even as the national debt increased and increased and increased because the supply was doing okay. Well, the penalty, all the chickens came home to roost recently when the demand was up and the supply was down and the inflation rate goes up. Now, I've sort of taken this along, and then I will now ask you a question. How dangerous is inflation in general? Who suffers when inflation occurs? And do you have any thoughts about what history might tell us?
Well, I'd actually like to make a few different observations.
Okay, great.
I mean,
Please
I
do.
think you can argue, I think the thing that you're probably getting at is that when inflation hits, the people who get hurt the most are the people with the most money because that money gets devalued.
No, I'm not
so-
making. No, that
I mean,
that won't be my point.
I mean, that's an argument. It's essentially a tax on people who have, so backdoor tax. So.
Well, no, that's not. I'll say.
Yes.
Well, you anticipated. It's an unusual situation, but you wrongly anticipated where I was going with this. And the deal is, inflation hurts the people that are the marginal players in the country. And if you have a lot of property, the value of the property goes up with inflation. So the terrible thing is not to have any property. So one of the things that, and I guess I'll get into this subject, one of the misguided things of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank was, you could say rightly or wrongly, they have two things that they watch. One is the inflation rate, the money supply story, and the other one is full employment. So they want a low inflation rate, a managed inflation rate, and they want full employment. Well, the two are contradictory, and in Europe or other central banks, they just have one mission, which is controlling inflation. Well, one of the things in this little, drama that our country's going through is the inflation. The central bank was basically pushing for a very low employment rate, full employment rate, and in doing that, they were encouraging inflation. But this and the people that search for jobs that want to work are often at the bottom of the food chain. Often, they're sort of a marginal existence, and it's true enough they may have a job, but the inflation demon that's been let out of its cage injures people in that socioeconomic group more than other people. So people that have large amounts of property, they have a good example might be they own a house, a big house or a little house. They own a house, they have property. The value of that is going to go up because it's the reciprocal of the value of the dollar bill. So anybody that owns something is going to be okay. The people that are going to be injured the most by the inflation or demon would be the people that are on the low end of the food chain. And even if they have a job, there's the money doesn't. There's not enough money to counter the increase in prices. So I mean that would be my point.
Well, I'm not talking about property ownership. I'm actually not talking about people who own property, but people who own money. Now, obviously, people who have large incomes, who have large bank accounts, are also likely to have property investments as well. And so you can argue that as the value of the dollars, if I've got $1 million in the bank,
yes,
and inflation hits, that $1 million has less buying power
agree
than it
with that.
did.
I agree
So
with
it's
that.
hurting me there.
I agree.
So you can argue that the $1 million of real property that I also own is a hedge against the declining value of my dollars in the bank. So now as to whether or not one perfectly counterbalances the other, I'm not enough of an economist to say. But.
This is a rather complicated story here, and I'm glad since neither of us are economists, it's fine for us to discuss this. Maybe a more knowledgeable person.
They're probably economists all over Macon right now,
Maybe
swooning.
would make some kind of comment about this, but a lot depends on what those dollars do. Mm-hmm. So if you just have it sitting in a bank account, it's true enough the money is safe, but inflation is going to eat that up. In general, I would say people with great wealth are very, and their advisors are well aware of this, and they put the money somewhere where it can earn something to stay even with inflation. The big question in doing this is the tax story. So the deal with income would be it's fully taxed. So presumably, if you had stock dividends coming in, and that was the way you were being rewarded for putting your money in a stock market, shall we say, that's going to be taxed at a very high rate, particularly if you're in a higher income group. So the tax rate, plus putting everything together, approaches 50%. Mm-hmm. So it turns out that people seek out other investments. And finally, what happens here is the relationship between the tax system, the way the government is trying to control things, the bad decisions they made with the coronavirus, all of that causes substantial economic inefficiencies. That would be my thought about it. So the money that's sitting in a bank is not going to be too useful. The interest rates are being arbitrarily kept down still by the government. The other point I think would be reasonable to make is right now, the same way the country suffered somewhat psychologically with the coronavirus, we're having a long impact on those contrary decisions that were made in regards to the economic underpinning of the country. So even though people say, well, you maybe you've heard this, the inflation rate is coming down, I can relax. But basically, if you've the inflation rate is just extraordinarily high and has been so for whatever period of time. I'll say, I'm making these numbers up slightly, maybe, I don't know, 10% now. Well, that's too high. Say 8% now and 6% last year, 14%. So that means the dollar bill that you receive has diminished by 14%, and even more so if that dollar bill is getting taxed. The income off of it is being taxed at a high rate. So that's causing all kinds of economic dislocations. That's particularly true, I think, for people that depend on pensions, or Social Security as far as that goes. Even though Social Security is, they're massively increasing that, almost 10% increase. If you don't have any property, it's very hard to maintain your living standard. And then if you have property, then there's some kind of protection. And really what's going on here is the wealth of the country, if you want to look at it that way. The demarcated wealth that's in the United States right now, as measured by dollars over the past whatever number of years, 2 years, that value has increased. So because the dollar has diminished in value and it's gone up a lot. On the other hand, the actual benefit for the people has not been there. And then the other thing that happens when this occurs is the way the government tries to equalize the situation is they do it by taxing income, but not wealth. And so if people have, I don't know, a big house, shall we say, and the value of that house is going up 10 or 15 or 20%, it goes up every year, and the person just sits on that. That's their wealth is increasing without the government taxing it. So inflation, just to get to that point, is a vexing problem from the government to getting money to take care of their expenses, with everything else being equal. And I would just say that, particularly as the national debt is so extraordinary. And finally, my other point on this is the government is keeping the interest rates low, still arbitrarily low right now, which is increasing the inflation risk. So if you say things are great now, the inflation rate, as people have said, the inflation rate has dropped from 8.5% to, I'm not making this up, to 8%. Well, that's still pretty terrible. That's 8%, and the people that depend on pensions and Social Security and getting raises at work, their situation is deteriorating, and the money that comes into their tin cup is being taxed by the government, even if their number goes up. So if your wages go up, I don't know, from $10 to $20, the government may take 2 or 3 of those dollars, and the prices have gone up $4 to $30. So that's a pretty substantial national dilemma. Now I'll put it over to you, and I know you want to talk about the Weimar, but keep going on that.
Well, I do sort of want to talk about the Weimar, but
see, I'm a mind reader.
But before I get there, I'm going to take issue with you about the causes of this. I see the causes as much deeper and more systemic and older than you do. I think you and I are just going to have to agree to disagree about the government's reaction during the coronavirus and you know, the idea of the Ocasio. That I think it's first and foremost, if you're going to have a big government, it's designed to maintain, among other things, public health. That if you compare us to the Spanish flu, obviously this did not turn out to be as bad as the Spanish flu, but I'm going to argue we had no way of knowing that ahead of time. And I think the only way you could prove me right is to go back in time and and have the government not do anything. And have 50 million Americans die.
I don't suggest not doing anything.
Yeah,
I don't suggest it.
But so the point is, I think that if there were not underlying conditions at that point, whatever happened or didn't happen, or whether it's good or bad, wouldn't have had a big impact. I think the first problem was going off the gold standard. And you know, that's giving the government carte blanche to create value and.
It was a Richard Nixon event, I think.
Well, it started with FDR. Started with FDR. Nixon just finished the process.
There was a peg. The dollar was pegged to gold.
Yes.
$35, I think,
yes.
for an ounce. Yeah. And then Nixon changed it.
But going off the gold standard and going to fiat currency simply encourages politicians and the Fed and the government in general to tax unborn generations in order to provide bread and circuses to whatever generation happens to be alive at the time. And to quote the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at some point the bill comes due. I think that leads to the secondary problem of these just absolutely horrendous national debts that no one has been talking seriously about now for about 50 years. And I don't know how we're going to deal with that. So I think once those two things are in place, then the freedom of action of a government that wants to try to keep inflation from hitting too hard is greatly constrained. And I think that's the situation we're in. If you want to look at a third systemic problem, why weren't our government officials in both parties taking Putin at his word since the end of the last century? He has been saying what he was going to do. We blew it off. We thought he was just blowing smoke. And now that he's done it, we're taken aback, we're horrified, we're shocked. The supply lines are affected terribly and pile on. So I think you have to take a long view of things. Nobody wants what happened, but it's a little bit late to come to the party at this point when we had been so thoroughly for short-term game laying the groundwork for them for the better part of 100 years.
Well, once again, I think we're going to sail into some deep water, not being PhD type economists, but we can make some comments. One of the issues is just a money economy going back to whatever that was, 700 BC in the Adriatic, on the Aegean. So we had gold, we have this, we have silver.
Croesus, the original.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have all this way that wealth is generated, and medium exchange goes there, and that turns out to be sort of a control mechanism. So if you have a lot of this currency, which I might call fiat currency, I mean, just to select something that's sort of hard to find, it looks pretty, and we'll just say that's what it is. I mean, you could have. Other places they use clamshells or whatever. I mean, other places big stones, But some display some kind of medium that's there that's hard to have, hard to find, and then that was used. And the temptations of anyone that's in power, it's not a new kind of temptation, but it's an old one. So the people would, firstly, the Roman currency, to pick one example, was devalued. You could pick the century. Here's something in, I don't know, 50 BC. This is the way it looks, and this is the way it looks in 400 AD. So it was gradually debased. The currency was debased, and people chopped little pieces of it out, and so it really caused a substantial problem, because the tendency is, but for a government.
If I can interrupt for just a minute, just for a fun fact, do you know why quarters have those little ridges along the edge of them? Dimes and quarters, to show that no one has shaved off the valuable money and made the.
Oh, the ridges, you mean?
Yes, made the ridges. Yeah.
Okay.
So there you go.
Well, there you go. So that's.
But moving right along.
All right.
So.
Well, so in any event, I think this, if it's part of a control mechanism, and if you have the ability to be the purveyor of currency, then it gives you a huge. You'd want to be able to just issue stuff. Governments get into trouble when they can't do that, and you could make the case that the French, pick one thing, the French Revolution happened because the government was doing whatever it could to support the U.S. Revolution, and the economy couldn't print enough money at that point to take care of it. Though the revolutionary government did, it put all these things out that were quite worthless. So generally, what happens is people tried over the centuries. The governments would basically try and inflate whatever they could. They could give paper currency, they could debase their gold and silver, and it stayed as kind of a value marker that was often violated. To say that the government has to run its books 1, 2, 3 because the gold standard. It didn't always work. And then finally, what you get into, and I think this is an important point, is the sort of Keynesian economics, where the government needs the flexibility to episodically push more money into circulation to prevent depressions. And one of the things that happened in the Great Depression was the government, or particularly Herbert Hoover, tried to balance the books and keep not have extra money going out. Well, the government's books look good. They don't have any debt. The debt's been kept down, and the way the cyclical aspect of human nature is people. If you got into a depression psychology, they would just never spend anything. It got worse and worse, which is the converse happens in inflation. So if you have a depression, you have, well, I've got a $5 bill here. It's going to be worth $6, $7, $8, and I'll just never spend this, and I'll grow my own food, and as a result, the social network, the social nexus is really severed. And when inflation happens, people think, I've got this $5 bill, I better spend it, I better get rid of it right now. So what the government is trying to do is go to some kind of equilibrium where there's just enough inflation for people to say, well, maybe I'll spend a little money, but I'll still save some. I mean, it's 2%, and I think they've said 2% is their ideal number. Well, on the long view, which I'll try to extract myself from in a bit. So getting into the fiat, I would say that it's good that gold has served its purpose for a long time and often been violated. And you could say Franklin Roosevelt violated it probably appropriately, I would say, in the 1930s. That would probably be appropriate. You could say maybe Richard Nixon, I think he was trying to respond to the Vietnam War, having said all that, I do take the case that there's so much fiat currency out there, there's no limit. Whatever the limit was is gone a little bit. And one of the things that's interesting is with all the inflation we have, the actual value of gold has diminished. So which is not what you would imagine would happen. So then we get into cryptocurrency, which you might talk about,
Well,
among other things.
it's just crashed very badly. I would say two things. I would argue that in theory, that yes, fiat currency can on occasion be useful, but you have to counterbalance that with the fact that ultimately whether or not we have fiat currency and by extension how much of it we have is up to politicians who are going to be very self-interested and usually out for short-term gain. And therefore that makes it extremely susceptible of abuse. Whereas if you have if you're pegging your currency to a naturally limited resource like gold, that ties their hands somewhat. And the tying of the hands can be a good thing as well as a bad one. And now that we're carrying something like a $30 trillion debt, the experiment, I would have to argue, has failed very badly. I don't think that gold has diminished in value. I think if you look over the last 200 years in terms of real buying power,
Well, the last few is what I'm talking
it's
about.
remained remarkably stable.
The last few is what I'm discussing.
Well, in the last 6 months, it's actually gone up. So because of this recession we're in, and I'd also point out something else. Look at the cyclical patterns. So you're arguing that these recent events, coronavirus or Ukraine or whatnot, has caused this recession, which the current administration is shying away from using that term, but I think we're clearly getting into recession territory. But look at the long-term patterns. We see a slowdown, either recession or depression, roughly once every 15 or 20 years. And the last big one was, of course, in 2008. That's roughly 15 years ago. It was about due for another one. Go back 20 years from there, we have the crash of '86. And then back, and it's very reliable about every 15 or 20 years. So I think you could argue that if it hadn't been this, it would have been something else. I will say, just anecdotally though, that this is the land of plenty. You and I both grew up in what was by that time the richest, most powerful country on earth. This is the first time in my life I have ever seen bare shelves on grocery store shelves. And you start asking, what is going on here? So.
Yes. Well, I'll make one or two comments. So I agree with a lot of what you said. And one thing is the political class, whatever the way the system works is they have a pretty short-term viewpoint, and they want to assuage their supporters. So if the supporters say, I want a new, airport constructed, well, great, particularly if the contributor is doing something. Or, I know that everybody wants something for free, and I'm up here for it, and we'll say, what can be free? Beer. I have free beer, and that's my running on that. You can have free beer, and whatever the cost is. And then many people would say, this guy's great, let's vote, he gave us free. And the long-term effects are just not considered. And if your time horizon, if I can speak somewhat sinisterly about this, often what happens with the political class, and I don't want to be mean to them, but they're humans, is they have a short-term viewpoint, and then they also try and feather their nest for when they leave politics. And that's not something that's clearly examined, and I'm not without sympathy for their situation, but basically their wages appear to be restrained, but under the table, all kinds of things are happening. And and that's not everyone. That's not all people are like that. But the idea of running the debt up is an attractive thing. And then finally, I'll say this about the debt. So what are we going to do about this $30 billion debt, or whatever, $30 trillion debt? Well, we could try and pay it back. That's one solution. Or we could just
if you want a depression, pay it back.
Well, okay. Well, I'm just going to. That's one solution. The other one would be, we're just going to make the economy really prosperous, and we'll have so much money that can take care of it. And the third one is we'll just have tremendous inflation. Well, so if you have this big debt out there, and there's no way to take care of it, and you're just the government is just going to basically devalue the currency. So, and I was making the comment about the national wealth that's there. So this relationship between the national wealth, whatever that number is, and the debt. And so as the currency is debased, the wealth goes up like that. And it's very tempting just to knock the whole thing off by effectively taking out the value of the dollar. And indeed, that is what happens in a lot of countries. That they have their currency, as you mentioned. This is a temptation for politicians. So looking around the world, there would be very few countries that their currency is not being debased right now, and that's a real problem. And it's one reason it's being debased, or the interest rates are being kept down as a low rate. So if you have a $5 bill and you earn a penny a year on it or something, well, you've got to get rid of it. I'll go buy something. And that's what many national banks are doing, and in undeveloped countries even more so. And the problem for these countries is their debt is in dollars. Their debt is in dollars, and so they're really the world crisis is out there, and the complexities of financial arrangements are not commonly understood and by anyone. I mean, real savants, which on the subject, I think we could say we're not. I'll say I'm not. But it's really quite complicated. And I don't think the general public understands what's going on here. Instead, they may say, well, the government is going to take care of me. I'll just go to sleep and not worry about it. And one of the things going on is the next electoral cycle. That's disturbed people a lot. The inflation is going up, and they can see their standard of living dropping. So the government passes something called, the Inflation Control Act, which would do, if it did anything, would make the inflation worse. But which is the height, in my opinion, of knavery. It really is. I mean, just tell the people what you're up to here. We're getting near the end here. Mm-hmm. Finally, I would say this, and I'll let you speak on the subject, is the social tranquility of the country depends on stable economic circumstances. So if we got into some terrible situation with inflation and people started to say, and you mentioned earlier the shelves are bare, people say, well, I don't think I can eat I'm going to scrounge around and find a piece of bread someone's dropped on the street, and that'll be lunch. I mean, getting into that situation would be absolutely horrific. And then the other thing to remember is the situation is worse than other countries. So the immigration across the border is a lot of this economic circumstance being driven by that. Do you have some comments?
Well, just one last one since we're getting to the end. The idea, you propose one solution is having a more prosperous economy. I would put it to us and put it to you that we had that and we gave it away. China has adopted a Hamiltonian financial policy, and look, they're going great guns. We outsourced all our productivity to China years ago, decades ago, and in the term of short-term gain for investors and corporate directors, and those jobs aren't coming back. So I think that's foreclosed now.
Okay, well, we'll conclude our little discussion, and thank you for being here once again,
Indeed.
Buck. And we talked something about a very important thing to most people, which is money. And it's a big thing.
Indeed.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.